something like that. But thanks a lot for joining after the end of history. It's great to have you here. I thought we could talk about something briefly, a little topical, and then step back and hear a little bit about your intellectual journey. Um, but I was interested in discussing today kind of when narratives reach an inflection point. On this podcast, my co-host earlier before I joined talked about the conflicts in Donbass and the two rounds of Nagorno-Karabakh representing kind of these coming wars and similarly like revelations that have come out about things like Gladio and Epstein seem to have brought about a kind of inflection point in the narrative where mentors of yours like Peter Dale Scott and David Talbot are now getting a lot more attention. And we had looked at another theorist, Guy Debord, who theorized this coming synthesis of war and propaganda and stopped peeling back the spectacle and narrative as really kind of part of concrete revolutionary practice. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about just where we're at currently with like major disinformation campaigns, if it's like the forever wars, even things like COVID or extraterrestrials. And then, maybe we could go back from there and talk about your research.
Sure. I think you're correct that the people are discussing the more serious scholars of the deep state in a ways that they weren't in decades past. I have been lucky enough to work with closely with three of the top people in this area. As you mentioned, David Talbot, who is a journalist and historian. And he writes with Karen Croft, who's another journalist and great researcher. She was his writing research partner, really great woman, great researcher. And David really gave up, running Salon, and he even had the chance to sell Salon once to Jeff Bezos. But he held on to Salon for a while. Probably regrets that on some level because he had the chance to make money. But then he wrote these books about the deep state. So he wrote a book on the Kennedy brothers and their assassination, and it was the first book to really detail how Robert Kennedy believed essentially what people like Oliver Stone and other researchers of the JFK assassination came to conclude that JFK was killed by his enemies, including people in the CIA, the National Crime Syndicate, and the military establishment. That it was a sort of national security state coup, and it also involved the people from the mob, and the mob and the national security state were a lot more intertwined than people realized at the time. And then those same forces came back to murder Robert Kennedy. And David Talbot was the first person to write about this. And after he wrote his book, Robert McNamara, after it came out, McNamara read it apparently and left a message on Dave's answering machine saying, "You got it right. And congratulations on the book." Which is funny because McNamara never really talked about these things. He did admit that Kennedy was trying to pull out of Vietnam and that he had been a part of this policy, and that he essentially endorsed what John Newman was arguing in his book JFK in Vietnam. So this is and this, is a process. Like John Newman wrote his book on Vietnam in the early 90s, and Oliver Stone's movie came along, and so it revealed some things about this. But for most people, they weren't paying that much attention unless they were really interested in the case, or they're sort of what you could consider conspiracy buffs or conspiracists and so on. So most of the people, a lot of the people interested in the case, it's sort of a parlor game of sorts. But David Talbot took it seriously. The professor Lance DeHaven Smith at Florida State took it seriously, and he wrote about state crimes against democracy. And Peter Dale Scott was writing about all these things, going back to the early 70s and, late 60s even, writing about the national security state and the intrigues that led to Vietnam. And then that took him to things like the Kennedy assassination, the CIA protected drug trade in Southeast Asia, and just the politics of the clandestine state to begin with, or overall. And my own work builds, I started off working with Lance DeHaven Smith, and then Lance fell ill, and that group of academics sort of faded away. Some of them died, two other ones died also, besides Lance DeHaven Smith. So I ended up kind of in graduate school without a real bigger cohort or set of journals I could write for or anything like that. I communicated with other people like Peter Dale Scott eventually and David Talbot, and I got to work with both of them in different ways. And it had been great to work with Lance earlier, but there's just a handful of scholars and serious journalists who have been looking into these areas. And I believe in the 21st century, the U.S. history has been such a series of just crimes. It's been dictated by these dramatic crimes, the trajectory of it. There's 9/11, which is still largely unsolved, I think. But it all points back to the same sort of neoconservative group. I mean, when you have Al Qaeda taking over, essentially Al Qaeda or ISIS, the same people taking over Syria, and everybody knows that we were controlling them and funding them, that the West was, and the Western allies were.
Right.
Then, and you look back also that we were using Al Qaeda in the 80s and then the 90s, even more secretly in places like Kosovo and Bosnia and Azerbaijan. You just realize the criminality here. And then the other constant that's really scary is the interconnectedness of the drug traffic and organized crime syndicate with U.S. national security services and the federal agencies in charge of investigating drug trafficking. I mean, it's the corruption and things like Epstein, where they're so obvious. And it's like, it's pretty much common knowledge that Epstein was a Mossad and CIA asset. It seems pretty apparent that the CIA outsourced some of these things like sexual blackmail and such to people like Epstein and presumably the Mossad intelligence service in order to blackmail politicians so that they would, adhere to the policies that the national security state wants, CIA and Mossad and all of the power structures that really dominate the U.S. empire and the regime that persists past presidents. It goes beyond parties and administrations. It's sort of this permanent regime that's secret, lawless, and not really at all a function of what the Constitution says or what you would think of as a democracy. Um, and as the corruption becomes more obvious and the criminality of these wars is more blatant, and now you just have genocide on TV, on TikTok and on your phones, and these horrible, horrible scenes, and you understand the crazy ideology behind it. It's just becoming more clear to people that the empire is a kind of a criminal enterprise, and that we're ruled. People are more open to the idea, which I would say is essentially an established fact, that we are governed by a criminal regime. And the regime in political science terms
Hmm.
is not merely the state. The state is that organization that has a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence and coercion and force in a certain territory, right? That's the state. But the regime is more than the state. The regime is all those institutions that collectively determine who has access, who controls the state. And that's what exists across administrations, and it's intertwined with things like organized crime networks who work with the national security state agencies in different ways and are connected to people in high finance. The drug trade in particular is a hugely lucrative part of the economy. Drugs, oil, and weapons are the top three internationally traded commodities. And so the US centered, and I'd say Mossad centered as well, um, crime syndicate, created in the 20th century, people like Meyer Lansky, Lucky Luciano, and so on, and later Santo Trafficante ran this after Lansky stepped down. It was protected by the FBI. It was protected by the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. It was protected by the inner sanctum of the CIA. People like James Angleton, the most secretive aspects of the CIA were also involved with these kinds of operations. So Epstein is an entry point for some people to see how corrupt this whole enterprise is. And his connections to Israel, just at the time that Israel is revealing itself to be so brazenly criminal and essentially kind of a Nazified political project, it's making, I think, more people wake up to things that have been there for a long time if they wanted to research it. But the whole of society and all of our sense-making institutions like universities and media outlets and political leaders these people in all these institutions, you really would be dismissed as a conspiracy theorist and some sort of lunatic if you actually had serious analysis about these things, or if you explained political and historical events with reference to the criminality that is hidden within this system of governance. And
Mm,
I'm pleased that it's that more people are recognizing it, and I'm hoping that maybe this recognition can contribute to a general understanding that this is a system that badly needs to be reformed. It's very predatory. This kind of mob ethos is sort of present in every industry. It just is controlled by a small group of people who take advantage of their position in the market and their connections to politicians to act against the public interest, but make themselves a whole lot of money. And it seems like, agribusiness, big pharma, the healthcare rackets, gambling online, oil, real estate, everything just seems to be a racket dominated by billionaires who own politicians and who these politicians write the laws and control the regulatory agencies to allow us to get screwed over all the time and to go for fight wars for reasons that are, for their benefit, not for the public benefit, that are criminal. The whole thing seems to be crumbling and losing legitimacy in a very dramatic way if you stop and look at it over time. I think that the American public has very little faith in this regime. They think they're crooks. The Epstein thing is going to upset, a lot of Trump supporters and other people. And it's just the latest sort of outrage. The Iraq War was blatantly criminal. What we did in Syria and Libya, blatantly criminal. Overthrowing the Ukrainian government in 2014 was brazenly criminal. But they're all working out disastrously. I think that the U.S. cannot win, and Ukraine is being slaughtered. How can you possibly say that we've been helping them when you look at Ukraine before we overthrew their government and Ukraine after? Its cause and effect is quite straightforward, and that's going to fail spectacularly. I think that Israel is on the ropes, hopefully more than people recognize, because they actually got hit pretty hard. It seems like they wanted the ceasefire against Iran. So a lot of these elements that have been propelling the sort of neoconservative, tilt towards just global crime empire in the 21st century for the U.S., I think that they have failed pretty spectacularly. And
mm,
the
mm.
real political issue of our time is recognizing this, having a realistic appraisal of where we went wrong, and then using that to inform the ways that we could reform this system and adapt to a world in which we just can't go around ruling the world like Western white imperialists have done for the last 5 centuries.
Yeah, on this podcast, we have actually some different minds about, kind of the state of the empire and some more pessimism about its longevity, um, versus some more kind of perhaps like right around the corner of these signs of defeat. But, I was wondering if definitely people should check out your podcast, American Exception. And there's a lot of great content there about deep politics and the deep state and kind of more of a dive on a lot of the things that you were mentioning. I was wondering if, since you mentioned going through academia, maybe we could hone in a little bit on particularly what do you think the state of that institution is? Because I would say that there's probably a little bit more faith, good faith out there still for the university system, as opposed to, just like the outright hatred and resentment that's felt for government and tech, some of those sectors. But personally, I just finished doing graduate work at UC Davis, and right at the end, I was seeing evidence of serious crimes that I tried to sort of write into a preface in my dissertation, where there's this film that came out on Netflix in the last few years called Octopus Murders, the
Yeah,
American
about Danny
history.
Casolaro. Yeah.
Yeah, and actually, our podcast is sort of friends with Christian, one of the researchers there. And there's kind of a chapter about this guy, John Philip Nichols. It's really like a little bit eerie. There's a moment in the film that I was actually like kind of experiencing this sort of fourth wall, like, if you go down some of these pipelines, like here's people who are just openly threatening torture and revenge killings and that kind of thing. Um, but one of the little side chapters that I looked into there was that this major researcher at UC Davis, he's the father of their veterinary program. There's buildings named after him, Stormont, that he like leaves UC Davis as emeritus, and about 3 months later, there's cables from Wackenhut, this massive espionage film firm, and they're shopping bioweapons that he says it could be used on a small country like Albania or a large country like the Soviet Union. And so, the implication is how could this person have left the university and been, producing um, like bioweapons in conversation with the US military in a matter of months? Like, and UC Davis has never had to answer for any of this. No one really cares about this at all. So, sorry for the digression, but I'm just interested in, where you think there is room in the academy for, if knowledge production is based on a kind of freedom of thought and what you're
In
describing,
theory.
these cabals that, we know are the money behind these universities. So yeah, what's your take on that?
I think that at present the universities are quite corrupt in a sort of structural way. My own discipline, political science, is very silly in it's the way that it describes politics. The most prestigious journals publish the most, banal. It's a strange sort of scholasticism, is really what it is. In the medieval times they would debate these things, but endlessly, but they all had to accept like these sort of fundamental core assumptions. And so, like, for example, the Earth being at the center of the universe, and it just became, you had to accept that, and if you didn't, it was, you were not a part of the program. I think that that is how it is in these institutions, and that the ones that are more important about subject areas that are more important are the ones that are the more ridiculous. So politics, political science, and economics, the discipline of economics, they're both more obscurantist, and they're sort of made up cosmologies determined by the wealthy people and who the foundations want to they want to fund they fund journals and so on. And if you want to publish in these journals, you've got to, please essentially the people that set up the journal and the sort of ideological preferences and methodological preferences they have. And so it just sort of self-perpetuates a bunch of people who believe the earth is flat in a sense. The fundamental assumptions of liberal political science is that there's democratic pluralism in the US, and there's essentially transparency, and we have a functional democracy in media, and so public opinion polls are meaningful, and so on. Really, all the tools of political science seem more or less designed to obscure political reality because we don't really live in a lawful system where we know what our leaders are doing. Instead, they are criminal and secretive and bent towards imperialism and lawlessness. And it's sort of institutionalized. And so if you speak, that's a very important fact. It's essentially, in my opinion, the only political issue that is really a political issue. Because if you live in a place where the political regime has a secret veto power where they can just assassinate people if they need to, and they have endless supplies of like drug money, even as they are incarcerating people for drug crimes. But the top drug traffickers are essentially intertwined with the state itself and protected by them. This is a frightening. This is a very frightening regime that we live under and that you can't do anything about. So when people are debating these other cultural issues, which I think is part of why they try to gas up culture war stuff in the academy, in different academic departments, in the media, and in the political system, is that they would rather have people arguing about these bitter cultural issues, and they become politicized, but in the bigger sense, they aren't really political because we have a political system that's not really democratic and open. It's more secretly fascistic and lawless and imperialist. And so in that context, it's very bizarre to be arguing about things like gay marriage, I mean, no, that's not an issue now, but it was the big hot button cultural issue, right? And it's like these are things that the people that really own, that are running the various rackets in the capitalist economy, legal and illegal. Well, I say legal in quotation marks or whatever. These people don't care about whether gay people are getting married. I mean, these are people who are kind of amoral. They don't mind if different policies murder a lot of people. They support wars that kill people. They're imperialists. They dominate in a sort of colonialist or neo-colonialist fashion as much of the world as they can. They absolutely do not care about these cultural issues, like that just is not. But it's like theater, it's a spectacle for people. So the academy is part of the problem.
Mhm.
But if and when it becomes clear to enough people who have some power and economic wherewithal, then you might see things change. So I feel that the collapse of this particular of the U.S. hegemony around the world and U.S. imperialism and this era of dollarized, mobbed up casino capitalism and imperialism that the U.S. has presided over, since the end of Bretton Woods, really, it gets firmly established in the 80s, and it just gets worse and worse and worse up to the present day. I think as that becomes untenable, it would be in the interests of prominent Americans, oligarchs, and everybody really to realistically assess where we went wrong. And I don't think at that point, academia could inform this. If academic departments, even if you just had a few radical academic departments that tolerated radicals and had some endowment to deal with, it could be really helpful. So I have a hard time telling people or encouraging them to do academic work in this area because upon graduating, I realized, or upon getting my dissertation, I realized that I didn't have, I would be very unlikely to get employment anywhere or get published in the journals, and that would give me a good employment right off the bat, a tenure track job or something, right? And so I started a podcast, but that is not a very reliable way. I happen to be lucky enough to be able to make about as much as I was making as a teacher, and that's fine with me because I didn't go into this really for money. I kind of would have preferred to have been a professor because I don't like being a public figure, thinking about my brand and other,
Yeah.
bullshit that you have to deal with in a capitalist market system.
Mhm.
I hate that system and I hate having to be, having to just accommodate it. But realistically, you have to pay bills. So,
Yeah.
that's what I do. So I hope that academia transforms, but I think at present, there aren't very many departments that tolerate radicals and give them good jobs and endowed chairs, et cetera, et cetera. It's sometimes a few people that have tenure become more radical and they speak about these things, but that's often it. People wonder how safe tenure is now, and et cetera. But I do think that the hope with academia comes from a reckoning that we're going to have as a society as to what the hell happened to this country, which always had problems, but it really was like the bad guys just kept winning political battle after political battle. And so the US goes further and further to the right. And it's just more obviously mobbed up, lawless, and imperialistic, and just a set of capitalist rackets to where I think it's discredited at this point. And so it discredits a whole lot of mythology we've been raised with. And a lot of the fundamental assumptions of different academic departments have really just been destroyed. And we're really in an emperor has no clothes moment. And the question is, what's going to happen? I think it's good that finally there's places like China, which has surpassed the U.S. in life expectancy, and that the global majority, I think, is uh, acquiring more power vis-a-vis the white imperial capitalists of the world. And this is a new development.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, it's interesting you brought up that turn to podcasting. I was kind of hoping we could go in that direction briefly. Like, the mass media, the legacy media is kind of in shambles, but they're also, I saw on the top podcast the other day, the New York Times and NPR, they're also breaking into the podcast realm, but just kind of staying on that beat about, freedom of thought. There's definitely a lot more of a free hand in podcasting, but on the other hand, this form is kind of inherently atomized, and there's this phenomenon of campism, like, depending on what somebody's listening to, you kind of know their ideology, even though, people need to consume content to be informed. So, one question is just like, what do you think are some of the best podcasts? What's the best content out there for people to check out? And then, just in addition to that, what are also some of the limitations of like what needs to happen for this form to not just stay in a bubble?
Well, I have listened to less conspiracy or clandestine statecraft oriented podcasts of late, and I kind of listen to more audiobooks if I'm going to listen to something. I feel that the political economy of podcasting and this particular niche, which doesn't really get any establishment support or boost from algorithms or anything, it kind of makes the people have to be their own little gurus with their holding court in their own sort of way and kind of creating a trying to make an island of themselves in a way. So there's not a lot of collaboration. It's people that I've done a whole lot of work shedding light on the JFK assassination and the Mossad angles of late. And it's been surprising that people that should be interested in this have really not responded to it. And I think part of it is if I were an academic or somebody who was just writing books about it, then they'd want to interview me. But I feel that the weird thing about having to be forced into this space is that people are like competition with each other, you know? I mean, I accept interview requests pretty much with anybody I can. That I turn down very few, if any. I think if they were like, I find if they were a Nazi outlet or something like that. But beyond that, if I determine somebody's not a Nazi, even I haven't done too many interviews with conservative people, but I would, in a sense, if they wanted to hear this, because I feel like it's important to get this out there. It's the only real democracy, the biggest part of our democracy that we still have, which is not worth zero, is the ability to try to make sense of this and explain it to other people. And that part is still the foundation of some kind of democratic system, some kind of better system that isn't just run by an oligarchy of private power and wealth and that controls the state, right? Like somehow we have to get to that point. We can still talk about it. So in the past, I think I've been on TrueAnon a number of times. They're always entertaining. They kind of go more, sometimes they're more into pop culture things going on. They have a huge following. And so, if you go into this, they're very successful as podcasting and
Yeah.
podcasting brand. And so if that is your aim, you in a sense become captured by your audience, I think to some degree.
Mhm.
And so I think that they're a little less precise with a sort of critique of the bigger system, and there's a bit of entertainment there. But I like all three of them. They're all cool in my experience with them, and they're pretty funny too. I used to listen to Black Op Radio all the time, and I still do every now and then because they have great stuff on JFK. Leno Sanik has been running that since like the year 2000, and they have a ton of episodes. And I think he also has access to, or he might be the person that still controls the Mae Brussel archive. And she was this radio personality in the 70s, and she did some writing and research on this. And she was a little, I think, a little bit crazy, I think, in some ways. This is Peter Dale Scott's assessment of her, and I think he's correct. But she was also, pretty smart about a number of things too. So she was interesting. Back in the 70s, she's sort of like a proto podcaster or something like that. Dave Emery has a big backlog of stories in these areas and investigations, and he really frames it as a battle against fascism, which I think is fundamentally on point. We're really talking about a different kind of fascism. And so, old interviews with Peter Dale Scott, anything from him going all the way back to the 70s, you can find some of those. He's amazing. He's a good friend of mine. I have many hours with him. We did this an oral history project that, he's in his 90s, so he doesn't speak in the rhythms of a podcaster. But if you listen to it, there's just amazing things involving his life and research on there. And yeah, audiobooks I think I kind of enjoy more than podcasts these days. I don't know too many of the ones, the political ones, and also my own focus is more on the like bigger questions. And I don't know of any other podcasts that are kind of looking at these things. It's hard to be a researcher in this area. Peter Dale Scott is probably the foremost person, and a lot of people base a lot of their understanding of deep politics or parapolitics on him, but I myself don't know how good of a grasp they really have because of the material, because Peter writes in such an esoteric style, and sometimes he doesn't really say the most important things. There's things I've realized in there, especially with Lansky and Israel, that I realize now is it's what I've been focused on more is the Mossad syndicate connection going back to Lansky, but really fought over throughout the 20th the post-war era. That's really important, and Peter has very unique work on that. But I also came to realize and spoke to him about this that he always omitted deeper investigation of the Mossad Israeli role, the Meyer Lansky role in these things, and partly because he was threatened, partly because his wife is Jewish, and partly because I think he actually, he's 95 and he takes anti-Semitism more seriously in kind of a cartoonish way, in my opinion, for an American at this point. So I disagree with him about these things, but like there's a lot there that I've been going back and looking at, and it's pretty wild. But I don't know that it's sort of the core of the whole clandestine, deep political system of the US. To me, it's the most fundamental question. And I don't know of too many people that are trying to look at it this way. So I end up probably recommending more audiobooks to people. Jim
Hmm.
Hogan has two new audiobooks out that are old books, but they're amazing. One is Spooks, and then the other one is on Watergate. It's probably still the best book on Watergate, called Secret Agenda. And those are really good. So I like Michael Parenti audiobooks too, or you can hear Michael Parenti lectures. I think those are really cool to listen to. I listen to Nima's interviews on YouTube because he has people that are pretty attuned to like the sort of geopolitical situation of the world. I'll watch Gray Zone interviews sometimes. I mean, I kind of watch interviews with. I like to hear Jeffrey Sachs talk about these things because he interviewed me and endorsed my book. That was pretty amazing. And
Yeah.
honestly, if you listen to him now, he's maybe the top Western public intellectual internationally. And most of the things that he says, I mean, he's cited my book before, and when he talks about the deep state, when he talks about Israel, he's on the same page as me. It's amazing. I mean,
Yeah.
he'll even talk about 9/11 and JFK. He'll talk about JFK as being, carried out by the U.S. regime, and about 9/11, he's more cagey about it. But he says like, we don't know if we don't really know what happened there. It'd be worth investigating. So to me, I think internationally they're even more ready to look into these things because people are like, we're the bad guys. We're just clearly the bad guys. The empire, the global dominance machine. We're the villains of history. That's the most. It's the most straightforward thing. Most of the bad things that have happened on the global stage are due to our consequences of Western imperialism in the 21st century, and there's not even any other actor that you can compare with.
Right.
It's even in the same league with the U.S. It's astounding.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. We've been like looking at the world wars from a perspective of realism and trying to get outside of the left-right duality and even doing a deep dive on a conservative philosopher, Emmanuel Todd. For my co-host, kind of more like the Chicago style of political realism. I'm kind of coming at it from narrative and, um, like that there's something just strange from that perspective about this discussion we're having that there's this phenomenon of conspiracy theory that they created the term out of JFK. I believe that like polls have always shown the US public like never bought it. I mean, the story is like they say this guy did it. He says I'm a patsy. He gets killed. The guy who shot him, he gets dragged away and has nothing to say. And then a CIA doctor who specializes in mind control comes out. They don't say that he's with the CIA. They lie to everyone about what he's doing. He says this guy's can't crazy and can't answer for it. I mean, the story is just preposterous on the face of it, and yet, the very conversation we're having, like, someone like Jeffrey Sachs has a lot of stature and breaks through, and yet they're still sometimes able to put it back in the box. And so actually, just I was wondering if talking about both, Peter Dale Scott has a famous poem, Jakarta, and uses poetry, and maybe was during his career more embraced by the poetry world than academia is my sense, where he was able to be kind of like, pushed off or like under exactly that sort of conspiracy. sort of slur. And then my co-host was saying like the Devil's Chessboard really employs detective, genre. I didn't read it that way quite as much, but I don't know if you like have any thoughts on, genre. Like why is that maybe a way that the clandestine activities can be accessed or conveyed?
Well, I think that the Devil's Chessboard benefits from David Talbot being himself not an academic and a person who has decent prose, and his assistant is good as well, and that they understood how to form a narrative with this material in ways that would be accessible to people who are not specialists, and there really are essentially no specialists in this area. So compared to Peter Dale Scott, David Talbot's writing, and they're good friends. David Talbot wrote The Devil's Chessboard because of things that Peter said that got him thinking about Alan Dulles, and David credits him with this. And so David Talbot has been more widely read. I think when the Octopus guys, the guys that did the Octopus conspiracy thing on Netflix, which I think is, kind of a mixed bag. I think that they went into a very confusing case without having, they were kind of, I mean, they sort of play this up in the film. They were kind of like Danny Casolaro himself, who really did not have the strongest grasp of history and politics, but was just sort of an American self-styled iconoclast, of sorts.
Did you
And so
review
he,
the film somewhere? Or
what's that?
did you make some comments on the film somewhere?
Yeah, we did a review of it. We and For the podcast in one episode. I don't know if it's unlocked or not, but there is enough. We did review it, and I liked it, and I thought on the whole I thought it was cool that they made it. It's just that there's so much backstory there that they can't really get into. I mean, when he died, Castellero died, he was on his way to see Peter Dale Scott. He was going to see Peter. Peter found this out later by people that had looked at his, itinerary because he'd been in communication with him maybe by mail, I guess. But he dies in that West Virginia hotel room. But that whole case is interesting, and I think that there's a deep political struggle in the early '90s that was a part of that. And I think it did involve very pro-Israel people, and that they were trying to expose some secrets of the national security state in a sort of a civil war of the deep state in a way. And H.W. Bush, who I think was against the neoconservatives, and he tried to force them to accept the Palestinian state. I think and it goes back to Reagan recognizing the PLO on his last days in office, that there was a conservative American pushback against what Zionist neoconservatism essentially. And I think that that explains a lot of the scandals that come out at that time that are leaked to the press, and stories are done about them, like the Franklin sex scandal
Yeah.
that links back to Washington, D.C. Also, a story published in the right-wing Washington Times about that in the late 80s. You had BBC doing Gladio expose, like a Gladio expose documentary. You had Oliver Stone's JFK, which was financed in part with an executive producer who was a Mossad asset, who was very key to them getting the nuclear weapon, back in the day. Iran-Contra itself seems difficult to understand unless you think that the Israel lobby and Israeli intelligence may have been behind trying to embarrass Reagan over these things and get leverage over the government that way. There's reason to suspect that that's what happened. So these subjects are really dense, and nobody really studies them in a very, they don't necessarily, there's not a body of literature that's like poured over by serious academics in a way that they can like evaluate what's the best information on this. It's just really a small group of people on the fringes that do it. So David Talbot's using that kind of narrative structure is, I think, a way to make it accessible. Peter's writing is much more dense, and sometimes Peter doesn't state what should be some of the more serious conclusions, I've come to realize. And so his work is esoteric and kind of inaccessible to people. So a lot of people have read different essays he's written, but almost no one has a grasp of the full arc of his work because it's so dense. He's a very unique and brilliant person, and researcher that it's hard to imagine how he did this stuff without the internet. That's his work has a whole lot of interesting material in it, and it is more laid out in kind of an academic way. But because he's not part of a discipline, it ends up being structured the way Peter wants to structure it, because he's just one guy kind of doing something that should be part of an academic program, but really isn't. He's just one researcher doing these books, and he's got a couple of them published at University of California Press, which was really amazing, on 9/11 and one on JFK.
Yeah.
So, but beyond that, there's very little traction for this kind of research in academia.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm a big Thomas Pynchon fan, and he mentions Castellare in his last book. Apparently, he's got a new novel coming out. He's really old at this point, but that's a place where his early work, Gravity's Rainbow, it's kind of amazing that he's able to give representation to the stuff about Operation Paperclip. It's all in there, but he's also somehow kind of representing something about the state of consciousness. People are being tortured and being put under this kind of crazy laboratory sort of it's like the Gladio world, but it's unclear. Like maybe he's a little cagey about what he wants to say and how he's saying it. I have to ask you one funny thing. You said you don't go on Nazi podcasts, but I wouldn't ask really anyone other than Oliver Stone this, but I don't know if my last name sent off any signals to you. My last name Cabell comes up in
Oh,
the
the mayor of Dallas, right? And the guy that was fired by Dulles, they were brothers. And then the mayor of Dallas was a CIA. It was just revealed that he was a CIA asset, but it wasn't really surprising because his brother was the top, one of the number two or three CIA guys.
Yeah.
I don't think that it's a great methodology to necessarily look at people's last name or
Yeah.
who they're related to, but it could be relevant if you were related to them. I would think it was interesting that you were asking me about these subjects, but
It's kind of a
well,
distant, my uncle met them once and, he just said, well, they fit the type, very backslapping kind of good old boys. But, yeah, there's the film actually gets into it a little bit because the mayor of Dallas had some purview over the route that the motorcade was going to take. And Charles P. Cabell, who was the deputy director of the CIA, he was fired with Dulles and apparently,
yeah, and
kind of
Bissell.
openly just hated Kennedy after that. He's an interesting figure. It looks like he got put in charge of some of the UFO programs, like the open, like the public stuff. If you look on his Wikipedia page, it actually
Yeah.
gets at that. It doesn't say what he was doing with that, but you know, uh, yeah, that's something that also you mentioned Dave Emery, like I've been around the Bay Area. He broadcasts out of Foothill College, and it's like a little community college there, and really interesting kind of broadcast. But definitely when you're listening to that, it's like deep conspiracy world. It's on like a tiny little radio station. You feel like you just landed on the dial. I had like a really spooky kind of pension-esque moment where someone had given me tickets to Shen Yun, this kind of like,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's like this just insane anti-China propaganda. But someone made the comparison like it would be like if there was a American pastoral theater going around China talking about like the wonderful deep let's reinstate the South and like kick out the communist regime that Abraham Lincoln instated.
Yeah, they're weird. They seem connected to right-wing intelligence networks, maybe CIA or maybe
And the
others who are
funding,
kind of to the right of the CIA. But it all seems to be
yeah,
part of the Western, para-fascist intelligence milieu is
yeah,
where they
yeah.
seem to come out of.
And
Like
there's
they're sort
billboards.
of like the old China lobby. They're like a Chinese version of like a weird remix version of the Moonies or something. They're cranks, but backed by intelligence agencies.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, that thing has been running, there's like massive billboards for it just all over the country. It's like a nonstop tour, just ongoing.
Yeah, and I taught Chinese history for a while, so it's just funny to the bullshit that I've only seen snippets of it, but it's so weird and stupid
Yeah,
when you look at it.
I'd like smoked a little weed and gone to this thing, not knowing, like kind
Oh,
of
that would
on
be
a bad
bad.
recommendation. Yeah, it immediately went really bad, and it was in downtown San Jose, which is kind of this like ghost city, like downtown San. I mean, old San Jose has like a really cool history, but anyway, I was just getting out of there really spooked
How
and
many people were in the audience? How many people showed up
a
for something
lot.
like that?
Yeah, a lot. I
Really?
mean, there's like this hokey
Were they
stuff
white people
where
or Asian people mostly?
I think, I mean, one of the two stars introducing it was like a corn shucking Kansas guy, just like the lamest kind of plastic smile and like putting this weird kind of um American face on the thing. But there's stuff about the Falun Gong cults, like the guy can fly, and so they actually have him flying, and like little kids are there, like oohing and awing at that. And in this like state of mind, I like just landed on Dave Emery's broadcast, and he was talking about Falun Gong, and like that was just like one of these awesome moments of synchronicity, like just totally like ripped me back into sanity because I was like, how is this a thing? How is this insane propaganda just like passing under the light of day? Um, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Chinese Communist Party is probably correct to determine them as essentially a group that's an enemy of the state for them. I mean, they're backed by Western intelligence and they are completely opposed to the regime in China that I would say has considerable legitimacy. They are Chinese people like their government a lot more than Americans like theirs. So, and things get better in China. They have a higher life expectancy, higher quality of life on pretty much every measurable indicator if you look at it in the aggregate. Whereas everything in the U.S. gets worse and worse, and nobody has any faith in the government because of that reason. As technology improves, we should be able to solve all these problems, but we just don't. Everything gets worse because we have this sort of parasitic oligarchy that wants to keep us in a state of precarity and material helplessness, I think, so that they have more power over us all. So, the Falun Gong propaganda is just laughable, and it's amazing that people in the West watch it. I don't think it's going to matter. I don't think the U.S. can determine what happens in China, and that's why they have to seize on these, ridiculous pretexts like Taiwan, which is agreed by the US and China and Taiwan to be a part of one China. It's and the only reason that it's not under the total political control of the Chinese people that run the mainland is that the U.S. gave so much money to these drug trafficking fascists headed by Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang. There's no legitimacy really to what the U.S. is trying to argue with Taiwan. And, I lived in Taiwan for a year. I really like Taiwanese people, but when you stop and look at it, the Chinese are correct that this is a egregious situation and that Taiwan should be part of China. That's setting aside what to do with indigenous people in Taiwan, but that's something for China to sort out as much as it is for the Americans to sort out. And the Americans should treat their own indigenous population much better, but China and Taiwan, they should figure out that. But the gripe that the U.S. has over Taiwan is it's not legitimate. And if it starts a war, it'll just be because the U.S. wanted a war with China. It's not because of any principle at stake.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There's this recent audio leaked of Trump saying that he's threatening Putin with bombing Moscow and Xi with bombing Beijing over Taiwan. I mean, the pretense, again, like the narrative seems like it's barely holding, and yet, I'm really on the fence of they seem to have the ability to commit these bold attacks, and Israel, has a free hand to assassinate people really anywhere at any time. So it's not clear to me like if we're coming out of this.
It really comes down to, are they really this stupid and this crazy? And then you can make a case for them being that way, but then every realist notion should argue against it. So
Mhm.
that's where I think that's the hopeful thing. Because if you look at what they did to Iran, the U.S. didn't that was a mostly superficial kind of thing. They really, Iran didn't strike back very hard. I think it was somehow orchestrated between them, like as a way to de-escalate the situation, that the U.S. would attack them, declare victory, and then Iran would say, "Oh yeah, they really did damaged us pretty badly." And then they fired some missiles at the base in Qatar, right? Wasn't that where they fired some
Yeah.
missiles at a U.S. installation? And then that was that. And I don't think that I think that the Iranians did not do the things that they could have done, which is attack a lot of the U.S. military installations in the Gulf, in the Persian Gulf, and in Iraq, and they didn't shut down the Straits of Hormuz. I think that this was kind of managed, and the logical thing for the U.S. to do would be to put an end to this conflict. And you're starting to hear talk of this, but it seems like can Israel really put that genie back in the bottle when they've wanted to carry out this final solution for Gaza after so long? But the U.S. it doesn't. Trump's base doesn't want a war at all. It would be a disaster, I think, from the logic of the U.S. empire. I think it would just destroy the U.S. empire and delegitimize it for all time if it hasn't been already. So, would they really do this? And if so, why? It seems like the only thing that makes any sense is this devotion to or the power of pro-Israel forces and Zionist oligarchs in the U.S. political system. I think would be the reason why. The same reason that Trump can't release the Epstein files.
Mhm.
And the reason that that he attacked Iran in the first place, and the reason that he's been okay with the Gaza genocide up to now. They have enormous power in the U.S. It's not strategic, I don't believe. People try to say, "Oh, they're just a cat's paw of the U.S.," but I don't. I think that was a hostile takeover of the foreign policy establishment by Zionist neoconservatives, and that it's been a disaster, as realists like Stephen Walt and John Mearsheimer argue. From a realist perspective, it's from an imperialist perspective, it's a disaster. That's why dedicated imperialist Dwight Eisenhower did not want he wouldn't allow them to do what they tried to do in the Suez Crisis, which was the first attempt at a big land grab for the Zionists. They wanted, they tried to take over the Suez Canal and big swaths of Egypt in that, and Eisenhower said no. So something happened between him and Lyndon Johnson, and it changed the hierarchy of the U.S. at the U.S. regime and the foreign policy of it. So that's worth looking at, but it's not in the interest of the U.S. And so are they going to continue in this to go on this path laid out by the New American Century people, the Clean Break Report people? It's madness, but are they going to do it? Now that it's come down to it and it's pretty clear that they can't do what they want to do, are they going to still persist?
Yeah. Yeah, you mentioned McNamara telling David he's right, and I just saw Sagar and Jetty and Tucker Carlson saying that in media, there all these people behind the scenes say that they agree with they understand that this narrative is just full of lies, but they lack the courage to say it, or and I'm sure you saw that in academia too. I think there's a lot of kind of cowling under the pressure of offending a wrong group and that kind of thing. So I just want to thank you for your courage in what you're doing, and we'd love to have you back on sometime with the full team, and hope that where can people find you and check out your work?
The American Exception podcast on Patreon. So it's just You can just do a web search on American Exception Patreon. That's one place. There's an audiobook version of my book and a print version of it, American Exception, Empire and the Deep State. I think that it lays out a lot of this theory. And I even have a Substack where I post articles that I've been writing on research that goes beyond where the book went. And especially, I've been looking at the National Crime Syndicate, Mossad, James Angleton's, CIA within the CIA, the sort of alliance there that I think played a bigger role in the Kennedy assassination and Watergate than I recognized before. And so I've just sort of expanded on the things I wrote in the book, and some of that is available on a American Exception Substack. But really, people, if they want to hear more discussions about this, interviews with Peter Dale Scott and Oliver Stone and a whole lot of other people that I've interviewed over the years that people might enjoy. I've also got some people like Gabe Rockhill, he's on there, Jeff Morley, Jim DiGenio, David Talbot. I recorded many, many shows with David. I have a whole lot of interviews there, so it's all at the podcast.
I really liked your discussion with Danielle Ganser, who wrote the NATO book. But yeah, definitely recommend those interviews. It's a great kind of great source for understanding some things about what's going on. Um, all right. Well, thanks a lot for the discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick, and I'll see you next time.
All right, sounds good.